We want to start our studies this morning by having a look at the remarkable things that are happening in Europe. And of course, 2016 had that spectacular event of the British voting to leave the European Union, which no one expected, certainly not David Cameron, who thought that his job as Prime Minister was very secure. He had won the election last year comfortably, and he thought we had another 5 years as Prime Minister of Britain, a very comfortable position. And he was so confident that the British would vote yes to stay in the European Union that he did what had been demanded by the opposition, at least by the UKIP opposition, for many years, and that is he went to a referendum, confident that he would win it. And of course we know the outcome. It stunned the British, it stunned Europe, and it stunned the world. And of course we had a repetition in the election of Donald Trump, and a third one this year when the Italian people voted down the changes to the Constitution and another Prime Minister had to fall on his sword. It's been a year in which God has been at work among the nations in a way that is quite remarkable. So what would be the outcome, do you think, of Brexit for Europe? Well, we're going to explore that this morning, both in what has already happened and what we believe must happen according to Bible prophecy. So nobody expected this, and just before the referendum, the editorial in the Daily Telegraph, which was a very pro-vote no paper, that is, they wanted to get out of Europe, they said this: if we don't pull out very soon, we shall wake up one day to find that we are completely under its iron thumb. Now, I found that very interesting because iron, of course, is the symbol in the scriptures for the Roman Empire. And I believe that one of the outcomes will be the reforming of the old Roman Empire on the territory of the old Roman Empire by 10 European nations. Not the 27 that are in the European Union, but by 10. The number of the toes on the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the number of horns on the head of the beast upon which the harlot Catholic woman rides in Revelation chapter 17. There will be 10, brethren and sisters. God is always precise. He doesn't just give us muddled numbers. It will be 10. And we're now watching the process by which that will come about. And I want to show you that that is actually happening right now as we sit here. So the angels have been at work, haven't they? Quite dramatically. We saw this in the case of the election of Trump. We certainly saw it in the case of Brexit. We put this passage up yesterday, Daniel 4 verse 17, that the matter is by the decree of the watchers, of course, who are the angels, who are sent forth by Christ now. He's in charge of the angelic group, and he sends them forth to accomplish things that must be accomplished. And one of those, of course, we're going to talk about this morning. And it goes on to say this, of course, that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. Now, it's a fact that a storm from France on Thursday the 23rd of June, which was the day of the British referendum on the Brexit vote, flooded parts of London, affecting the transport system and making access to polling booths very difficult for a lot of people. Now, the British, and certainly Cameron, were confident that London would carry the day, that the yes vote would win, because there are millions of people who not only live in London, but work in London. And of course, London is the financial capital of the world, leave alone Europe. It's certainly the insurance capital of the world. And all of these people, of course, are very dependent on the continuance of business, not only with Europe, but with the rest of the world. And so there was a confidence that London would carry the day. What they didn't count on, of course, was the fact that an unusual storm, and it was a very unusual storm, would enter from Europe. Now, storms simply don't come from Europe into Britain. And that point was made by this newspaper, the Daily Express, on the 23rd of June. Summer storms almost always hit Britain from the Atlantic in the west. But eerily, they say, the huge storm smashing the country today, so this is on the very day of the election, swept in almost precisely at midnight from the direction of Brussels. Brussels is the headquarters of the European Union. That's where the European Parliament is. Storms don't come from there, brothers and sisters. They come from the west, from the Atlantic. So the angels were at work on the 23rd of June to ensure that all of those people that work in London didn't get a chance to go and vote. And you know what happened? Midnight it came across, 11 a.m. in the morning, so that people who went to work, and it was a normal work day. That's why the polling booths were open till 10 o'clock at night. So people who went to work would say to themselves, well, I'll go out and have lunch and then I'll go down to the polling booth down the road, put in my vote, which will be a yes vote for most of them, and then I'll come back to work and then I'll go home. Well, they couldn't get out at lunchtime because there was floods in the streets of London. There was no transport system. It was all closed down by midday. And then, of course, it backed off a little bit, and another one hits at 5 p.m. when everybody leaves work. And so these people thought, oh, well, I'll just leave work at 5 o'clock, I'll go down and catch a train, and I'll go home and I'll go to the polling booth, which will be open till 10 o'clock. They didn't get there because there was no transport system, no buses, no taxis. So nearly 2 million people in London didn't get to vote. And the no vote won by 1.7 million. If that is not the hand of God at work, I have never seen it. This is a very real case, brothers and sisters, of the Most High ruling in the kingdom of men, setting up over it whomsoever he will. He wanted Britain out of the European Union because we know that that's required by prophecy. We've been saying it for decades. They have to come out of the European Union, and it happened in 2016 by direct divine intervention in human affairs. That is the case before us. You know, they say things like this. Thousands of people are believed to have been unable to get back to vote at polling stations before 10 p.m. Vote affected by flooding and bad weather. Here are the people lining up. They can't get to the polling booth. Here are the cars. They can't get down the street because of the flooding in London. Isn't that marvellous? Isn't that a wonderful sign that our God is at work in the earth? So let's just consider why Britain had to come out of the European Union. Britain is not part of the image of Nebuchadnezzar. There are those who have made the point that Britain was once part of the Roman Empire for hundreds of years. That was true. But by the time that the two legs of the image of Nebuchadnezzar were formed, Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire. And you see, we know, of course, that the Roman Empire went through many iterations. There were times when there were two parts to it, times when there was one empire. Constantine ruled over just the one single empire. But before him, there had been 4 parts to it. And so it went on through its history. But by the time that we get the two legs separated, Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire. Rome left Britain between 383 and 410 AD. So this is a very important matter, isn't it? They are not part, Britain is not part of the image. Now historians will tell you, and this is a summary from historical commentators, that when Theodosius died in AD 395, he had 2 sons. They were both very young. Honorius was 12, Arcadius was 17. And they say that the empire was divided between these 2 sons. And this division of the empire into eastern and western parts was the decisive one, say the historians, which sent the 2 on separate ways. One of the 2 emperors had always enjoyed seniority over the other. However, the accession of Arcadius and Honorius is widely seen as the division of the Roman Empire into 2 completely separate parts. By 410, the separation was almost complete. And it was 420, of course, 420, when the decisive time came for these 2 legs to be formed. So by 410, the Romans were out of Britain. Let's just follow what happened here. Now, you can't read that from the back, so I'll read it to you. The departure dates. 383, the final departure from the west and north. 401, final departure, Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian's Wall is here. 407, final departure from the southeast, from this area. 409, the expulsion of Roman magistrates from the cities. And 410, the rescript of Honorius, which ended Roman occupation of Britain. So the 2 legs were formed in 420. So Britain had been out for 10 years by the time that the 2 legs of the Roman Empire were finally formed. So Britain was not part of the image, and God has made that very clear to us this year in making sure that Britain has come out, that they will be the Tarshish that opposes the invasion of Gog in the land. And we know, of course, that this country, Canada, will also be involved as one of the young lions of Tarshish. And they will be there in that day. Now, the historical young lions, as we pointed out yesterday, are Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. Now, we know this because this is a First World War poster calling upon people to sign up to fight against the Germans. And so we have the Empire needs men. And down here we've got all answer the call. Helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes. So who are they? Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. And of course this is a fulfilment, we believe, of Ezekiel 38 verse 13. That these powers are going to be involved in opposition to Gog in the day of Armageddon. So in 2007 and 8, the global financial crisis actually exposed these young lions, because among the countries who survived the global financial crisis of 2008 the best were Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. Is that coincidence? I don't think so. Because you see, God is at work. All of these, as we pointed out yesterday, have a British system of government, and 3 share the Queen as titular head of state. So Canada, and the country that I come from, are firmly ensconced amongst the young lions. America, as we pointed out yesterday, is not a young lion, and that was the position of our community for 100 years before we got off the track on that one. And I put this picture from Punch magazine up yesterday, so it doesn't need to be there for very long. But of course, that tells the story from the world's perspective. They understood that too. So what about our teaching then, brethren and sisters, on Tarshish? Well, going back to the writing of Elpis Israel, a publication in early 1849, Brother Thomas states this on pages 447 and 448. He talks about that there was also a Tarshish to the northwest of Judea. This appears in the case of Jonah, and he talks about how Jonah went down to Jaffa, and he caught a boat. He was going to go off to Tarshish. So he goes on to say this. He says, it is not exactly known where the western Tarshish was situated, because what happened in history was that Tarshish actually moved. It went from Tyre, and they set up another place in the Mediterranean, in the Adriatic, and so it moved right across. But the final port of call for the biblical Tarshish was unquestionably Britain. That's where it ended up, Britain. So Brother Thomas goes on to say this. Addressing Tyre, the prophet says, Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with silver, iron, tin and lead. They traded in thy fairs. Now he's quoting, of course, from Ezekiel, and we'll come to that in a minute. These metals are the products of Britain, celebrated by the Phoenicians as Baratanak, or the land of tin. So here is Ezekiel 27 verse 2 and 12, which Brother Thomas is quoting in Elpis Israel. And so we won't read that again. We'll read this comment. This comment comes from another historical site. The Phoenicians discovered the tin deposits, they say, of the British Isles through their own exploring and seeking out of new products and markets for them. They kept the knowledge of the Cornish tin mines a closely guarded secret, so they could control trade in the metal and charge a high price for it. Sounds a bit like today, doesn't it? Innumerable ancient workings in Cornwall still attest the trade, and tin is still mined there today. So back in 2005, I made a visit to Cornwall. Had a little bit of an opportunity to do that, and a brother and sister took me down there. And what did we encounter? All of these old tin mines. Tolgus tin. Okay, so tin was a very major product of this area of Britain. And this is where the Phoenicians settled. And they were there for a long time. They actually dug wells. Now the Phoenicians dug square wells, while the British did it a little bit easier. They dug round wells. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you want to make an easy job digging a well, dig a round hole and then put the stones around it. Phoenicians went a little bit further than that. They dug a square well, which is much more difficult, and they built up the the stones and the bricks around the square well. British didn't do that. So we know from the evidence that is still there that the Phoenicians were ensconced here on the south coast of Britain, and they were there for a long, long time. And that land that they were in became known as Baratanac. Later on, of course, by extension, Britannia, the land of tin. So you see, we've got evidence from Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 12 that the Tarshish that we are talking about is actually Britain. And they are going to fulfil that role of Ezekiel 38 verse 13, together with their young lions. This little article also helps the Phoenicians and Britain. The fact that the tin trade existed is too well attested, they say, to need proof. Herodotus, as early as 445 BC, speaks of the British Isles as the Tin Islands, or the Cassiterides. Pythus mentions the tin trade, as does Polybius. Diodorus Siculus gives a detailed description of the trade. He tells us that the tin was mined, beaten into squares, and carried to an island called Ictus, joined to the mainland at low tide, probably at Mount St Michael in Cornwall. The trade existed as early as 1500 BC. And Sir Edward Creasy writes, the British mines mainly supplied the glorious adornment of Solomon's temple. Now, that's incredible, isn't it? The adornment of Solomon's temple. Well, that's true or not, I don't know. This matter ties in very well with the involvement of Phoenician builders with construction of Solomon's temple. Well, of course, the Phoenicians were involved, weren't they, in the construction of Solomon's temple? Where did they get some of the materials from? Probably from Tarshish. So you see, there is a lot of evidence in history and in the scripture that tells us that Britain is the Tarshish of Ezekiel 38 and verse 13. And of course, with the demise of the smug, confident David Cameron, who had to fall on his sword, we have the election of Prime Minister Theresa May. Now, she's made some rather amazing statements recently, and here's one of them from just 6 days ago. Under the heading, in this headline, Britain swinging toward unqualified support of Israel, you notice there is a question mark after Israel. This was the way the newspaper presented what she had said in a speech. So she has made it very clear that she supports closer ties of Britain with Israel. And she was speaking on this occasion to the conservative Friends of Israel on December the 12th. She strongly urged greater cooperation with Israel. Okay, so this is an amazing thing, isn't it? That God should put in power the Prime Minister of Britain, who has to manage the exit from Europe, rebuild, as they've said they will, rebuild their economic and political ties with their former colonies, which are the young lions, and give support to Israel. Where are we up to, brothers and sisters? Where are we up to in the scheme of things? Can you see what God is doing? And it's happening in this year. What does that mean for next year, do you think? Well, I think we can be pretty confident we're close to the end. The time is coming. And I mentioned this yesterday, that she added in that speech the significant note that the Balfour Declaration had been one of the most important letters in history. It's only got about 2 paragraphs. One of the most important letters in history, written on the 2nd of November 1917 by Lord James Balfour. And that, of course, was the basis upon which the British got their mandate. That was the basis upon which ultimately the state of Israel became a fact, and the fig tree shot forth leaves in life once more in the earth. Amazing things. And this lady here understands the importance of the Balfour Declaration. And so does this lady. The future submission of Britain is guaranteed, brothers and sisters, because Queen Elizabeth turned 90 this year. She called in her book that she published on her 90th birthday, she called Jesus Christ the King she serves. Now, Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Church of England, which, of course, we know is a carbon copy of the Catholic Church. The only reason that Henry VIII wanted to depart from the Catholic Church was that the Pope wouldn't let him divorce and remarry. And, of course, we know that he did that quite often. So he didn't want the restrictions of the Catholic system, but he didn't want to change his religion either. He didn't want to change his doctrines. That wasn't what it was about. But the Reformation did come from the separation of the Church of England from Catholicism. But they are very much a carbon copy in terms of doctrine and practice, which, of course, the Catholic Church is represented typically by Tyre, Ezekiel 28 verse 2, because Tyre was a trading power, and so is Catholicism. Whereas Tyre traded in goods, Catholicism trades in religion. So God uses Tyre as a vehicle, as a type of the Catholic system. So that's why we think maybe that if God gives her another 10 years of life, and her mother, of course, lived until 101 in good health with all her marbles, so if her daughter takes after that, there's still time for Queen Elizabeth to do what she's alleged to have said she will do. She's alleged to have heard about Christadelphian teaching. I was told this in Britain some time back. She's alleged to have said that if Christadelphian teaching is true, she will cast her crown at the feet of Christ. And of course the scripture says she will. The daughter of Tyre, says Psalm 45 verse 12, the daughter of Tyre shall be there with a gift. Even the rich among the people shall entreat thy favour. So who knows what God has in store for Queen Elizabeth II. It may well be that she's the latter-day Queen of Sheba. You know, when you talk about the Queen of Sheba, don't get sucked in by the world's view of the Queen of Sheba. They present her as some beautiful young woman who turns up and there's some kind of relationship between Solomon and her. That's all rubbish. No young woman who ruled a country with a whole heap of wealth would risk going from Ethiopia to Jerusalem through the wilderness of Sinai with all of the problems and difficulties and dangers that presented. Nobody would do that. You would be stupid to do that. But if you're 90-something years of age and you know you're about to kick the bucket, who cares if you get taken over by crooks on the way? All right? Who cares if they steal all your money? You're not going to have time to use it anyway. See? So I don't think there's any doubt that the Queen of Sheba was a very ancient woman. And she wanted to go and see this King Solomon before she died. You know, that was, as they call a bucket list. It was the last thing on her bucket list to do before she died. And so I think that is also a type of where we sit now in the scheme of things. I'm not going to read this article, but this has influenced the Queen. This was on the 18th of May. This was about a book written by this gentleman here, a former British General, Sir Alexander Shirreff. He published this book about a 2017 war with Russia. Now these words in green are the ones that I want. In a chilling scenario, he predicts that Russia, in order to escape what it believes to be encirclement by NATO, will seize territory in eastern Ukraine, open up a land corridor to Crimea, and invade the Baltic states. Well, I think, yes, it's quite possible that very soon Russia will do exactly that. Take Ukraine, because that's the heartland of the original Russian Empire. All right, that's where the Rus originally established their kingdom. And their first capital was Kiev. And of course we know that Vladimir Putin wants to re-establish a Russian Empire. And you can't have an empire without your original heartland, can you? So that's why he wants the Ukraine. He'll get it. That's why he took Crimea. And he'll eventually take Ukraine. He'll have a land bridge to the Black Sea. Whether or not the Baltic states come into it, I know nothing about that because I can't see where the scripture speaks about that. But this fellow here is pointing at what the world knows is coming. There's going to be trouble of some kind. Now the Queen, of course, knows all about that. And in a meeting that she held with the head of her church and Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, very recently, this was reported on the 18th of October, she said things like this: "My beloved country is about to enter its darkest period in the coming months as a brutal and apocalyptic," interesting word, isn't it, "apocalyptic war will be waged in the East." Then she makes this statement: "I am not concerned with the trivialities of Christmas. I am concerned with the terrible consequences we must face as the war drums beat ever stronger." Isn't that interesting? here is Queen Elizabeth talking about things that most of the world doesn't understand, but she can see them coming. And she said that if Christ does come and establish himself as king in Jerusalem like the Christadelphians say he will, she won't believe the Catholic doctrine of Antichrist. She will go and cast her crown at his feet. Won't that be a wonderful thing? Now, this is the meeting that she was involved in. I'm not going to read that. This just tells us the details of what happened on the 18th of October. But I will read this, because this gentleman here is Patriarch Kirill. Now, he's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church that want Constantinople back. Okay? We were talking about that yesterday. They want Constantinople back. And this is what he said to the Queen. Patriarch Kirill told the Queen about the revival of the church in Russia in the past 20 years. The construction of churches, the development of the theological science, the growing number of dioceses, and in general about the spiritual growth in Russia. So he's boasting about how religion has overtaken Russia. Well, of course, even Vladimir Putin says he is a religious man. He, of course, thinks that he's leading a country that has a religious a crusade. And that the Pope now believes in him. That the Pope says that Putin is the only one he can look to for help to save Christians from persecution. Isn't this an incredible development? I mean, this guy Putin is one of the greatest thugs that ever walked the earth. I've got more religion in my little left finger than he's got in his whole body. And yet the world has been deceived by him. Now, is that fulfilment of Bible prophecy, do you think? Yes, it is. Because you see, Brother Thomas, when writing about Daniel 8, verse 25, do you remember what Daniel 8's about? It's about the little horn of the goat. Do you remember what he said about that in Help Us Israel? He said that whoever is in possession of Constantinople, regardless of their religion, regardless of who they are the little horn of the goat of that time. The last occupant of Constantinople will be the Russians. The Russian Orthodox Church will go back to its roots. They will get Constantinople back. And when Russia controls Constantinople, we'll have our eastern leg of Nebuchadnezzar's image. Yes. Very, very significant. So how's this going to come about? Well, let's read. Daniel 8:25 says, and through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the Prince of Princes, that's Christ, but he shall be broken without hand. So in Help Us Israel, page 409, Brother Thomas writes this. What kind of craft are we talking about here that's going to, by peace, destroy many? What kind of craft? Well, he says, he also acknowledged and increased with glory the universal bishop, that's the Pope, as a God above every God of his dominions. Through his policy, he also caused craft. He's talking here about the rulers in Constantinople who supported the papacy in the West. He caused craft to prosper by his power. Priestcraft. Notice this. This is the craft he's talking about. It's the craft of religion. Priestcraft gained an ascendancy in Europe, which it had never attained before the rise of the Germanic Romano little horn among the kingdoms of the West. Brothers and sisters, let me tell you what's going to happen biblically. When, and I don't believe we'll see this from here, when Russia takes control of Constantinople, they will then cause priestcraft to prosper in Europe, because on the back of the things that happen in the next little while will be one of the greatest depressions in human history. And the nations of Europe, which are already bankrupt, are going to go down the gurgler big time. You know what happened in Russia in the 90s? When the USSR fell apart? The people went back to religion. You cannot rule Russia today without being in hock with the Russian Orthodox Church. It's impossible. Putin knows that, which is why he kowtows to them. Kirill, the head of that church, said that when he came to power, he was going to make the Russian Orthodox Church a Putin church. And it is. They're using religion, and by peace, by priestcraft, they will destroy many. And so when this depression hits, we'll talk about this in a minute, what will happen is that the European Union will completely fall apart. It's already falling apart. And we'll end up with 10 nations south of the Rhine and of the Danube who will be dependent on Russian support and upon papal support. And to get them through, they'll do what the Russians did in the 1990s. They'll go back to religion. Okay? That's what's going to happen. And that passage will be fulfilled in its fullness. And when that confederacy has been developed, they will come down upon the mountains of Israel to be destroyed by the Prince of Princes. We are sitting on the very verge of wonderful things, and we're watching them happen before our very eyes. So while we're talking about what's happening in Britain, just one final point. You see the heading of this slide, the shabby ships of Tarshish? Well, this is a report that came out on the 21st of November, so it's very recent. And it talks about the strength of the Royal Navy since 1985. In 85, they had 4 aircraft carriers. In 2016, they have 0. They had 2 assault ships. They've now got 3. They had 41 frigates. They've now got 13. They had 15 destroyers. They've now got 6. The British Navy is a mess. Oh yes, they've got some aircraft carriers on the planning stage, and they're looking to build them, but they better hurry up. You know what the scripture says about the ships of Tarshish that try and intervene in the eastern Mediterranean to stop Gog's invasion? In Psalm 48, verse 7, we are told that thou destroyest the ships of Tarshish, thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. Russia's navy today is very, very powerful. There are, in fact, in the 2 Syrian ports that they own, Latakia and Tartus. Tartus was built with Russian money completely, which is why they won't give Syria up. Right? They have 11 ships in those 2 ports, Tartus and Latakia, that the world acknowledges no other nation on earth has got anything like it. In fact, it is now said that American planes will not fly anywhere near those ships because they can take them down just like that. Okay? They cancel out all of their technology that they use, and they can take them down like that. Russia is well and truly advanced. Ships of Tarshish don't have a hope. By the way, the east wind is a simple way of saying the Gogian forces. You know where the east wind comes from? Well, just the term, east wind. Where does the east wind come into Israel from? You got it. Syria and Assyria. Okay? This is the work of the latter day Assyria, destroying the British Navy in the eastern Mediterranean in the events that lead up to Armageddon. But of course it's all going to end reasonably happily for Britain, because Psalm 72 points out, doesn't it, that the kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents, the kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts, yea, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him. But Tarshish is going to be in the vanguard of it. They're going to be in the forefront of those nations who submit to our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, very quick word before I get on to Europe, and I'm going to have to be quick, Brother Jim, but very quick word about Sheba and Dedan. Did you notice that Sheba and Dedan come first in Ezekiel 38 verse 13? So it's not Tarshish, it's the first cab off the rank. The first powers, the first nations to object to the Gogian invasion of the land are Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You know that? Because that's who the Sheba and Dedan are. Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now, how do we know this? Well, of course, if you have a look at old maps, this is the kingdom of Sheba, or Sheba. This is Yemen of today. And of course, you go to the historians and those who think they know. This is Wikipedia. Modern archaeological studies support the view that the biblical kingdom of Sheba was the ancient Semitic civilization of Saba or Sheba in southern Arabia in Yemen. So what's happening in Yemen? Well, next door, of course, you've got Dedan. Dedan is Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So we've got now amazing things happening. Saudi Arabia has actually been putting together a club of nations in this region, especially the Gulf states, and is intervening in Yemen to try and solve the problem there. Without going into all of this that this article talks about here, there's a civil war going on in Yemen. And it's been going on for a couple of years now. You've got you've got an ISIS-backed group, the Houthi, who are trying to overthrow the legitimate government of Yemen, and there's other crowds as well. And the only way that this is going to be resolved is that Saudi Arabia has put troops and tanks and planes in there to try and defeat the Houthi rebels. They're not doing all that well at the moment, so they're going to have to step up their campaign. But it will be stepped up because, you see, when Russia makes a move in Syria, it will become absolutely critical for Saudi Arabia to bring on board as many nations in that region that they can in defence against that Russian incursion. Leave alone Iran, and leave alone ISIS at the present. You know one of the nations that's most upset about the impending fall of Aleppo and Syria? Saudi Arabia. Why? They have put so much money and effort into supporting the rebels against Assad that they're going to lose a whole lot when Aleppo goes down. And so they're very, very upset. They will make sure they don't lose this one here in Yemen. And when they win, and they will, because we know the scripture requires it, when they win, we will have locked together as very close allies Sheba and Dedan. Isn't that amazing? It's happening in 2016. So very quickly, let's move on to Europe. What are the consequences of Brexit for the European Union? Well, Europe is being violently shaken, not only because, of course, of the activity of ISIS-related people, but by many other things. One immediate outcome of that disaster on the 13th of November 2015, when 130 people were slaughtered in Paris, was that in the first round of elections that followed just a few weeks later, in December, the National Front received the largest vote in the north and south of France. Now, the National Front is a hardline right-wing political party in France. It is led by a woman called Marine Le Pen, whose picture you will see in a minute. She deposed her father, a very radical man. He would have fitted comfortably into Hitler's cabinet. He was such a hardline fascist. So she has modified somewhat his policies and made the party look more acceptable. But she's still very hardline, as you're going to see. And she has some remarkable policies. She is favoured to win, at least in the first round, to go into the presidential elections in France in April, May next year. She's favoured to win in the first round and to go into the second round. It is likely that the two candidates that will be put up in the second round will be both right-wing. And whether she wins or the other guy wins, the same thing's going to happen. France is going to leave the European Union. France is going to establish a strong relationship with Russia. That's going to happen next year, brothers and sisters. And the world knows it's going to happen. It's going to be another Brexit-like event in France. You know what Marine Le Pen did on the Monday after the Brexit vote was announced? She got up in the European Parliament in Brussels and said, France should follow Britain's example and leave the European Union. Well, what happened, of course, when the second round of voting was held in those elections back in December last year, in actual fact, they played politics in that country. Now, as I said, ISIS killed 130 people. Hollande was praised for his response. He's a socialist, by the way. You know what his approval rating got down to? 4%. You know what it was when he said he wasn't going to stand for the presidential election just a couple of weeks ago? 15%. You can't win an election with 15% support. So he stood aside. The leader of the right-wing National Front, Marine Le Pen, looks likely to ultimately lead France in the future. Now, as I said, the National Front did not win a region in the runoff elections on the 30th of December 2015 because the socialists, led by Hollande, in desperation, withdrew from National Front strongholds and advised their supporters to vote for Sarkozy's centre-right party. Now, the centre-right party is the enemy of the socialists in France. But they were so desperate not to allow the National Front to win that the socialists withdrew their candidates and said, please, please vote for our enemies. Isn't that incredible? So they kept the National Front out temporarily. But you see what's happening there? It's a huge political swing going on in France. So what about this woman? She advocates leaving the Eurozone, withdrawal from NATO, abolition of the International Monetary Fund, limits on immigration, and forging what she calls a privileged partnership with Russia. Yeah. And by the way, it was reported in November this year that France has a major far-right Eurosceptic and openly pro-Russian party that receives funding from the Kremlin. So if she wins the election next year, it will be won with Russian money. There are idiots, people saying that Donald Trump is the president of America because of Russian intervention. Okay? Well, it could be, who knows? But it's most likely not all that true. But you see, they don't understand what we understand. God is in control. And what he wants, he gets, regardless of what man wants or thinks. And so I can see something coming here, and so can you. This article here, Daily Express, 4th of October 2016, says she calls for the collapse of the European Union, talks about nationalising banks. She sees the US as a purveyor of dangerous policies and Russia as a more suitable friend. She wants to bring an end to immigration and believes the Republic is under Islamist assault. And so they go on to say that in the French presidential race next year, she's likely to have a huge influence and may well win. Isn't that amazing? If anything like this happens, and even if the other guy gets in, he's got a policy of a strong friendship with Russia too. We are going to have Gomer of Ezekiel 38, verses 5 and 6. Gomer and all his bands is a reference to France and Belgium. Okay? Isn't that amazing? It's unbelievable what's happening this year. But it is happening, brothers and sisters. That's why we say it's time to lift up our heads, because our redemption draws nigh. Now, I got this earlier this year when I was here in Canada. I got this from the Globe and Mail of Toronto. It's there. I think it's their major paper in Toronto. And they had this illustration of Europe unwinding, like, a lady's knitting. If something goes wrong, it sort of unwinds. And so they represent the unwinding of the European Union. And of course, that's exactly what is happening. Let me just give you a report card on a few of the countries. Now, I want to ask you a question. If I ask you the question, who do you think is the strongest economic power, financial powerhouse in Europe? Most of you would say Germany. True? Would say Germany. You're very wrong. Germany is in big trouble. Not the least because of the 1 million Syrian refugees that have crammed into their borders in recent times, but because they haven't been playing the game properly as well. Germany's the country that says, Achtung, you must do it our way. But they're not doing it their way. And that has brought about this problem. A report to be put before Schäuble, who's the German finance minister, next week, and this of course is pretty recent, February 2016, states that unless Germany starts making huge cuts to its state budget, it will be unable to sustain the debt burden caused by an ageing population and a low birth rate. That's regardless of the 1 million refugees. That wasn't around then. Unless the finance minister takes drastic action, the German debt to GDP ratio will reach 220%. By 2060. You know what Greece's is right now? 160. So Germany is shortly going to be in deeper trouble than Greece. Did you know that? You see, Germany is, as they say down here, being a central pillar of the Eurozone, is under huge pressure to keep within the fiscal rules of the single currency agreement, which they're not doing. They're not keeping their own rules that they insist on other countries keeping. German Treasury has predicted substantial sustainability risks to the country and reports that the Eurozone is set for further bailouts because of fears over another sovereignty debt crash. What about Portugal? I'm not going to read all that for the sake of time. Portugal is in la-la land when it comes to finance. And they are in deep trouble, as, of course, is Italy. That's why the Prime Minister tried to get the population to vote for changes to the Constitution so they could end the political gridlock in Italy that doesn't allow them to manage the country and its economy. They have a 22% unemployment rate in the south of Italy, and that's what they declare. Imagine what it really is. Okay, so Italy is in deep trouble. It's going to be bankrupt, if it's not already bankrupt, very shortly. A Brexit and Trump-like event, as we've mentioned a couple of times, happened on the 4th of December this year. Italians voted no to a raft of constitutional changes designed to rescue the country from political gridlock and disaster. What about Greece? Well, we know about Greece. What do we need to say about that? We all know about Greece. They're still borrowing money and they're still not able to get anywhere near what the European Union says they should be doing in that country because, of course, of the social backlash that they get from people out in the streets. Well, where's this all leading, do you think? Well, it's leading to this, brothers and sisters. Revelation 17, verses 12 and 13 say, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour." Now, 1 hour in apocalyptic terms is 30 years. This is post-Armageddon, by the way. "These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast." We know from the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image and from the 10 horns spoken of here in this prophecy, the 10 horns are 10 kings, that there will be 10 nations in southern Europe that will form or reform the old Roman Empire in Europe. That is what has to happen. And the papacy, by that time, will have enormous power among them because it will be on the back, we believe, of that Great Depression that's coming. So the European Union, as we know it, is doomed. It's doomed. It's already falling apart. And it won't be long before it's completely gone. And what we will have are 10 nations in this area here. In the area of the old Roman Empire. And that, brothers and sisters, will see a fulfilment of Revelation 13, verses 1 to 10. In other words, a revival of the beast of the sea of the past, where the papacy has absolute political power. It will be the fourth beast of Daniel 7, verse 7, the revival of the Roman Empire of old. It will be the Babylon the Great of Revelation chapter 17. And we are watching it happen. As I said, what will likely bring it about will be the depression that the world knows is coming. Now, you've probably heard me speak about this before, and I've got to be very quick because of the time. But Christ made it very clear, extremely clear, that we would be taken in times of prosperity, general prosperity. That's why he uses the times of Noah and the times of Lot. He could have chosen any era of judgment. He doesn't. He chooses the times of Noah and Lot because those times were of general prosperity in human society, at least in the areas that those things concerned. He doesn't mention, for example, in Luke 17, when he talks about, he doesn't mention violence or immorality. Why not? Well, because he's only concerned with the real problem for his people at the end of the days, prosperity. That's why he says in that context, remember Lot's wife. What was her problem? Immorality? No. Violence? No. They were out in the streets. Her problem was integration with the materialism of the time. See, so that's his warning. That's why he chooses this era. But of course we know that what happened in the days of Noah and the days of Lot was that prosperity came to an end. It came to an end with divine intervention. Yes, that's about to come to an end again. Because this period here, this period that we talk about here, is in actual fact, brothers and sisters, the time of the resurrection of the dead. And that will be followed by a time of trouble such as never was, as Daniel chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 point out, because that time begins. It's concomitant with the resurrection of the dead. How close are we to that? But this is how it happens. 1929, we had a stock market crash that led to a worldwide depression. It took them 10 years to dig out of it, and then only by a war. Wars, of course, not only stop mouths, you don't have to feed so many people, but they also allow people to go back to work building armaments and tanks and planes to destroy more people. Okay? That's how you bring a depression to an end. We're on that track. It's close. And the times of prosperity that this world has known are about to come to an end. And 10 years down the track there will be another war, the last war, the Battle of Armageddon. Yes. And we'll be at the judgment seat. well and truly before that time of trouble descends upon this earth. We'll go on the eve of that crash, brothers and sisters. There are ominous factors at work. US debt has topped $20 trillion. That's their borrowings. Their actual debt is probably closer to 150 trillion when you take into account all of the unfunded liabilities like pensions and all sorts of things like that. 150 trillion. You know what the world earns in aggregate? All nations on earth in aggregate earn in GDP each year between 50 and 60 trillion. That's the earnings of the whole world. And the US owes 3 times what the world earns every year. That is a recipe for disaster. And it's coming. Many European countries near the brink of a financial collapse. The European Central Bank has taken incredibly stupid, drastic steps recently. I used to work for a central bank, and what they're doing is stupidity of the highest order. You would only do it in desperation. They know that bankruptcy is coming. The oil price, of course, is another thing that the angels have used. Did you know that the Russian treasury will be empty by the end of this year, and that's not too far away? And they made that statement themselves back in February and March. They told the world that the Russian treasury would be empty. What would you do? Well, I know what I'd do. I'd do a Hitler. Hitler took the Rhineland, and then he took Austria and took their treasury and used that money to then build his army, and then he took the Sudetenland, and then he took Czechoslovakia. That's how you fund your developments of your army. Yeah. And Russia's in Syria, remember? I know what I'd do. I'd take Syria and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan, as the Bible says they will. How close are we? Sanctions and low oil price push the Russian economy towards collapse. And China, which of course has had growth rates of 12% for a decade or more, is down close to 6%. That's what they tell you. And economists were saying in the mid-90s that if China gets to 6%, the rest of the world goes into a depression. And Britain, of course, leaving the shaky European Union open market, endangering the European Union, of course, as well as the world's economy. A lot of things at work, brothers and sisters. And then God brings on the scene this man who says he's going to slap a 45% tariff on Chinese imports. If he does that, the whole thing will collapse. And he's just as likely to do it, isn't he? I mean, he's a loose cannon. Yeah, he's just as likely to do it. So we're close. I think he's been put there for a reason. The world knows it's coming. This is a copy in a modern newspaper of the October 29, 1929 Milwaukee Leader. This was the announcement of the collapse of the stock market. All right. So what will this crash trigger? International bankruptcy will force radical and rapid change. Middle East peace will be achieved at last. Israel will annex the West Bank and subdue Hamas and Hezbollah with Russian agreement. Bankruptcy will allow rapid Russian expansion without effective opposition, and a group of papal-backed nations, 10 of them, will emerge in southern Europe and the territory of the old Roman Empire, while Israel will remain relatively prosperous on the back of huge finds of oil and gas and their ingenuity. That's what's going to happen, brothers and sisters. It is really time, isn't it? It is really time to lift up our heads because our redemption draws nigh.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthandProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthandProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos, videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch, and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.